Thank you so much, and good evening, everybody. And I'm going to be doing this presentation with two of my colleagues, Burt and Injairu Kulundo, who will join me in a couple of minutes. So I am going to just be quite brief. I feel a little bit both humble but also inadequate to represent my entire country. It's an incredibly beautiful place. It's an incredibly rich place. It has 58.7 million people now. It's a country that is and has been in quite a complex and also quite fractured transition from apartheid and the long history, 350 years of colonial intrusion before that, which produced some of the worst atrocities of apartheid. It is also currently in a process of rapid urbanization. More than 50% of the people are living in urban areas, but there's a huge movement between urban and rural, so you can't classify it so concretely as urban or rural. It's actually a much more complex interactive system. It's a country that is caught in multiple contradictions and is also characterized by extreme inequalities. It's one of the countries that has the highest Gini coefficient in the world, and it's one of the reasons why we're actually adding an extra SDG, which has been, ignored in all of the SDGs, which is incredibly interesting. The one at the bottom that keeps falling off, which is really relates to the fact that, 1% of the people are owning pretty much more than half of the world's population, and that is mirrored in South Africa in terms of the inequality level. So we are, trying to make sense of what to do about that, and it hasn't changed since 1994. So this is something about transformation processes that, unless one is much more critical and honest about them, they can actually just continue. So we need to be more critical and honest about what's going on, also with the way that SDGs are produced and framed and monitored and managed. And we're doing quite a bit of work in that area at the moment in our research center. So these things affect the country's children. They affect women particularly, and also young people. And I was so kind of touched by Millie, actually, when she came in, because I think I was 17 when I, like her, started with activism, and it was the time of the state of emergency in South Africa. I think Leon will remember, when we had tanks in the townships, and it was just a very terrible time for our country. And I started being an activist then, and I was her age. And it was literally 10 years later that out of student activism, I was able to begin to be part of a transformation of our country and to start reimagining what a transformed country could look like. And one of the first things that I was invited to do after being, actually while I was a student activism during my master's degree, I was invited onto a curriculum committee, and the first thing that we did after 1994 was we literally took Koki pens and we were scratching out the most extreme references to racism and sexism in the syllabus of the countries in the Western Cape. At that time I was in the Western Cape syllabus, and after that we started the process of restructuring the system and rewriting the curriculums, and it's kind of was also a very kind of generative period of time in terms of transforming how the country was set up, structured, and trying to get, shift some of those very heavy legacies of apartheid. I think since then, which is in 1994, it's 20-something years now, and we've learned that transformation is not so easy. So this transformation has been contradictory, and as I mentioned, it's still affecting especially the most marginalized, women, youth, children. And we have very high levels of gender-based violence, which is a kind of kickback, I think, of the long histories of oppression. We have forms of colonialism and racism that continue in quite extreme forms, actually. We have a major challenge of thinking about the futures of our young people. We have this, our countries, Poonam talked about these concepts that our countries produce. They're sometimes very strange, and we have one called NEETs, and these are young people that are not in education, training, or work, and there are nearly 8 million of them between the age of 15 and 34 years. And we have 6.2 million adults that are also classified as NEETs, and we have 29 to 30% unemployment. So we have these challenges, and it's really difficult to work out how to deal with them, especially when the macroeconomic policies are seemingly, pushing the contradictions further and deeper into places that are difficult to get out of. So transformation for us is an ongoing priority. It's not something you can think about you might like to have. It's something that one has to live with and continue to work at, and to continue to find ways of being positive about transformative processes. And early on, we were able in our education system to integrate the concepts of healthy environment, social justice, human rights, and inclusivity. And then we've had to work literally 20 to 30 years to make meaning of that in all levels and phases of the education system, not only in the schools, but in teacher education, in the vocational education system, in the universities, in community education, in youth social movement programs. So it's a huge challenge and project. It's a lifelong project, lifelong learning project for us as much as it is for everybody else. And so we continue to do that work. And what one needs to do is to find ways of sustaining your energy for transformation. And one of the most beautiful things I've ever been part of, actually, and I'm so happy to see her at the back there, is my great friend Akpezi Ogbukwe, who was working with UNEP, and she led the mainstreaming of environment and sustainability education in African universities. And what she did was she really built in us a passion for understanding the power of Africa, and she really inspired me for so many years. And we have sort of taken on this way of thinking about the African continent and our work and who we work with and how we work. And we really are taking this very much to heart, and we're thinking that we can't continue to think about Africa and to project views of Africa for what she's not. We have to think about and project what Africa is. And I loved the Somali presentations and also the other presentations here. And how do we build on the strengths of what we find? And what's very interesting for us now is that we're seeing a kind of a new energy for transformation 25 years later. It's beginning to emerge. It's quite kind of interesting in its kind of constitution. And it comes in the form of all sorts of things. It comes in the form of social protest. It comes in the form of reimagining. It comes in the form of rethinking what we're given. So we've been given the SDGs, and here we are busy rethinking them in a more accessible format for teachers, for children. So you can go to a child and a teacher and say, let's love water. And you can really begin to talk about and think about what these things mean, actually, these global policy statements mean at a practical level and in a classroom and in a community and so on. So we're kind of trying to reimagine them, but we're doing it critically. We've added one about, put down the weapons. It's interesting that in all of the sustainable development discourse, in over 25 years, there's nothing about demilitarization. There's also nothing about holding transnational capital to account. Hence, we have there, number 20, hold big business to account. And this one at the bottom, everybody always talks about poverty alleviation, but they don't talk about what to do about this 1% of agglomeration of the world's wealth. So I think we have to be a little bit more, edgy and so on. So I want to just invite both Jane and Injairu to just share little pieces of the work that they're doing in this kind of trajectory of, reimagining, reconstituting, being more edgy, being more transgressive in the kind of educational research that they're doing. So over to them.
Good evening. It's lovely to be here. In the spirit of what Heila was talking about how Africa is often known for what she is not and not for what she is, the research that has been emerging out of the center that I have been a part of has been part of a collective called the Not Yet Uhuru Collective. And this collective is basically a group of young change drivers from across South Africa who have very vociferously taken up a lot of space in the country to assert a future that is worthy of their longing, I don't know if any of you were watching the news around 2015, 16, 17. There was a huge uprising of students from across South Africa, and it was sparked by the Rhodes Must Fall movement. And it was a huge discussion that was brought to the fore unequivocally around decolonizing universities and access to universities and all of this. I know that was out there in the news, but I think what's a really important aspect of the conversation that Heila was adding in when you think about the inequality is that when you're looking at those protests, it was mostly students who had some sort of access to universities who were at the forefront of that. And what you end up not seeing as part of that is the millions that you're speaking about that are left out of that, for whom which even access to these spaces isn't possible. And so a big question just that sits around a vision for sustainable development is, what about all of these other young people who are left out from so many of the barriers to education that start all the way from ECD level? And so the work that I have been doing with the Not Yet Uhuru Collective has really been about acknowledging the millions of young people across the continent, the youngest continent in the world, but in South Africa particularly, who are working towards issues of the common good in their own way, who are creating their own decolonial rights in the way that they see fit. And as a way of trying to get into the conversation around sustainable development, the critical question that is held at the center of this work is that if we would to just for a moment just relax our ideas around what we think sustainable development should be, and if we just relax our ideas around how we think we need to inculcate young people to be particular kind of citizens in order for them to be a part of the kind of world that we think we're imagining, what would happen if we just took seriously the skepticism, the anxiety, the anger, the brilliance that young people are experiencing? And so what the Not Yet Uhuru project was really about is just about listening. The word attuning came up very strongly in our session this morning, attuning very strongly to the way that young people are instinctively moving towards a future that's worthy of their longing. And a big part of this has been about creating cultural artifacts, creating music, surfacing poetry, generating ways of us hearing ourselves much more loudlier. That's not English, but you know what I'm saying. Generating ways for us to understand what it is that we are hearing and seeing, and in so doing, starting to create a very strong archive of the praxis that is currently underway. So in many ways, the project is really about opening up a generative creative space for young change drivers from across South Africa, and hopefully an invitation across the continent and the world, of course, to start to identify the way that we want to instinctively move and what we're being challenged with, and to grow that praxis for ourselves. So that's part of the work that we're doing there.
So after that, I don't really need to say much more, I think, because Injairu has really covered our work in the most beautiful way. But maybe what I can add is I work with the same young people, unemployed, maybe have got through a little bit of formal education, who are powerful care workers. They're people that, with nothing, care for their rivers. And I really mean that. It's in a sense, people come to the course that we run, which we call the Change in Practice course, are literally 3 young people who come to the course because 24 people died, and nobody can tell them why. But they have a suspicion it has something to do with the water and the mining pollution that's upstream. So those are the people that we are working with. And maybe what I can add to what Injairu said is, what is the role of an educator activist in this space? And what we've been exploring is it is also the work of a care worker. It's about being a fierce care worker. And I mean fierce not as a lion going after prey, but as a mother protecting her child. And I also talk care work because it's not just about coming with content. It's about working at the multiple levels where we have lost care for ourselves because of apartheid, colonialism, gender violence, that is linked to water. In South Africa, water is the space of the ancestors. So to harm water is to harm everything about our beings. And yet we talk about water at the level of structure as a resource, something that we use for our own benefit. But if we are not working with these other meanings of water that come through working with people, young people who live this. So what is amazing about the Change in Practice experience for me is that we are also learning how learning happens in the same way that we are enabling or providing a space for young people to come and research their own matters of concern. So we don't have a curriculum. People arrive and we work with what they need in order to be able to take their projects forward. I suppose I've lost what the point I was going to make. But it's yes, that's it. I've got it. With the whole process is understanding that I think everywhere in the world, education has been violent in some ways. Okay, I think maybe in some spaces it's been able to be more caring, but in a lot of places it's been violent. So we always start the course with acknowledging that violence and then working with the participants to help us become better educators. So whatever they bring to the course, whatever pain they bring to the course becomes part of the way that we're trying to open up spaces, which includes gender violence. And social movements in South Africa are very patriarchal. Great, yeah. And there's a lot of racism as well that stands with us in the room. So the educational space becomes the microcosm of working for a different society that we want to have outside. Thank you.
Thank you so much to Jane and Injairu. And if I can just say that there are many other amazing researchers like them that are doing incredible work to help us to rethink this question of loving learning. I just wanted to also just add finally a big appreciation to Leon and the team here at the University of Bristol. I think it's fantastic to be here. It's my first visit to Bristol and we're very excited to be part of the project as well. And thank you to everybody else who's come out this evening.